So why the API testing is important these days? So if we have already well tested the UI part, that is, we have already performed manual testing or have also done automation of the UI part. Now, what is the need of API testing? Why it is required, or what if we don't do API testing at the initial stage? Is there any drawback of not doing API testing? So, so let's take an example. Let's say I have a login API with the URL or the URI as https example.com API and login, right? This is the login API, right? So whenever you perform login, you actually use the method type as post. Why post? Because we are creating a session, right? So when we need to provide the data, let's say in an API, we're gonna provide the data as our email. Let's say we'll be providing the email, and then we're gonna provide the password, and if the login is successful, session being created with the help of this login API for this particular user, right? So now let's say if I talk about testing this API, so what all test case that you can think. I'm not talking about automation over here right now, but in general, if we have to test this login API, what all test cases we may write. So the very first test case might go like validate login API with valid username and password, right? Similarly, the test case second will go like validate login API with invalid email format, right? The third test could go like validate login API with an email ID which is not registered, right? Similarly, the fourth test case could go like validate login API with valid email and invalid password. And so how I mean, there are a lot of permutation and combination that we can do, like the same way we do it in terms of when we are writing manual test cases, right? So if you take a look at these test cases, these test cases look similar to the test cases that we write for when we are manually testing the login GUI part, right? So as in let's say if I go to any application where we could find a login window, let's say I go to Myntra, and here they have shifted the login to, okay, I'm already logged in over here. So what I'll do, I'll open up in incognito mode. So if I click on login, so you can see this is the login GUI, right? So if I have to write, don't worry about this Facebook or Google button over here. I'm just talking about this login GUI part. So here, like if I want to write manual test cases for this login window, so the manual test cases would go like enter, like if I talk about a positive scenario will be enter a correct username, a correct password, and click on login, right? Then we can have negative scenarios as well, where we can inject some invalid username and password, we can like enter an email ID which is not registered. So it will look something like these cases only, right? So the same thing that we are actually hitting in this URI while testing this web service, same thing we are doing at the GUI part, right? But what is the benefit of doing API testing? Because API testing, generally we do it before the UI is actually tested or the UI is actually released to the testing team to perform manual testing or automation testing on it, right? So APIs are tested initially, right? Till the time, even let's say even the UI is also not designed, right? Till the time APIs are not working fine, the developers may not integrate API with the UI part. So developers, as in I'm talking about front end developers over here. So in any organization, there are front end developers that designs the UI part, and there are back end developers, right? The database developers. So back end developers generally create these APIs, create the business logic, right? And the front end developer, they integrate that business logic with the UI part, right? So now let's say if I am testing the UI part and I encounter some bug at the initial stage while entering the correct username and correct password, it won't allow me to log in, right? I got a message that the login is not successful. So what will happen at that point of time? I'm gonna raise a bug, right? I'll raise a defect, and I'm gonna assign that defect to the UI developer, right? To the front end developer. Now front end developer will gonna do all the validation, and he'll come to know that this bug, this issue is not related to the UI part. This is actually related to the business logic, right? So what he'll gonna do, he'll gonna assign this bug to the backend developer, right? Now backend developer will gonna validate the bug, will gonna come to know that okay, the issue is related to the login API not functioning properly, right? Now if as a tester I would have initially done testing on the login API part, right, and I could have encountered this issue at the initial level, at the API level itself, I would have directly assigned it to the backend developer, and he may have fixed that bug. And once the testing is done at the API level, then only the UI developer will going to integrate those APIs, right? So this will going to actually going to save a lot of time for the front end developer and even for the manual tester who are actually responsible for testing the UI part, right? Before we hand over the APIs to the developer, before we do like the testing on these APIs, we find all the defects in the APIs and we get it fixed. It should not get integrated with the UI part, right? So this is the main reason why API testing is very important, because these days if you talk about any e-commerce application, any travel domain, any health domain, banking domain, any major application, you talk about Amazon, Flipkart, Facebook, all these applications communicates to each other using APIs itself. So their business layer is actually designed using REST. 95% of the websites are using REST APIs, right? So if we actually perform testing of these APIs at the initial level, then at the UI level, let's say if still I can encounter a issue while testing the UI part as well, right? So let's say I am performing login on this page, and like I entered correct username and a correct password, and I still got a message over here that the username or password is not you've entered is not correct, right? So the other reason could be the APIs are working fine, right? We have already tested the API part. maybe the UI developer has not integrated the API correctly with the UI part, right? So the response that the API is sending, the UI developer has not mapped that response correctly with the API, right? So the bug could come at any level, but at the initial level, if we have thoroughly tested the API, you're gonna find very few issues. Like most of the issues may be related to the cosmetic part, because see, APIs have nothing to deal with how the look and feel of a button is. API is not going to check the check boxes, the radio button, all the options available. The APIs are majorly gonna test the business logic, right? So if the business logic is working fine, if the login API is working fine, then what all test cases majorly that you have written to validate the login, you may not find any issues while you are testing these test cases at the UI level, right? So you're gonna face cosmetic related issues, not related to the business logic. All right, so that is the reason why API testing is very important these days. And every next automation opening, you're gonna find the requirement of Selenium plus the API testing, right? So API testing is very much in demand in these days. If you are finding if you are on a job portal, if you're finding 5 openings for Selenium, then you're gonna find 10 openings for Selenium plus API automation, right? So that is what the importance of API these days.